Lovely. Thank you very much for the invite to come and talk to you all this morning. I work with Alessandro because since January this year, I've become part of faculty research and business engagement. So it's a big move for us in the imaging facilities. So it's great to be able to have this opportunity to start linking up the actual imaging activities in the university and translational research. And hopefully I'll be able to share some of that with you this morning. So before we start, I just thought I'd show you this is a bit of a work in progress mission. So it's not the final version, so don't go off and say, oh, this is definitely what imaging is going to do. But we came up with this about 3 years ago, so it's quite a long work in progress, but there are reasons why, and I'll tell you about that shortly. But it's just about the impact we want to have on translational research within imaging. So we can do this from, as Fiona said, from preclinical through to clinical imaging as well. And we work with a range of university members of staff, commercial sponsors, and also academic sponsors. So we cover a wide range of activities. So in terms of, this is our version of the imaging translational pathway. Anya, yours was very much more slick than mine is. But what this just demonstrates is where the equipment is and how that fits into the translational pathway. So I'll talk you through the ins and outs of the kit and where it is and why it fits into those particular headings. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you will see that the 3T MR scanner at the clinical research facility, so that's there as MCRF, covers both experimental medicine and also clinical scanning. The reason it's in experimental medicine is because the Manchester CRF was funded primarily for experimental medicine purposes. So we've had to put it in there, but it is also used for clinical scanning as well. So this is a matrix that Andy Brass and I came up with when we were part of the Division of Imaging, Informatics and Data Sciences. And what this just shows is that imaging, we're in a very lucky position actually, because imaging covers pretty much every disease area going. And most of the modalities other than PET-MR, which I will come on to, are already out there in the clinic being used for patient benefit anyway, which is fantastic news. So we can see from the vertical columns there the typical disease areas that we work with, but we can work with many more than that. And then the vertical lines are the cross-cutting themes. And it's really interesting what Annie was just talking about, because the one at the very bottom, machine learning and big data, is a real push area for us. Because if you just think about how many scans are performed in the NHS on a daily basis, all that data is there sitting for us, for our clinicians, for our academic researchers to look at. That there are ethical considerations, of course, with that, in terms of patients only come for a clinical scan, so they need to understand that it could be used for research purposes, and also the logistical side of things, that the scan images can run into. I'm no technical member of staff, but they run into big gigabytes per scan. So we're talking about an awful lot of data there that we would need to think about having an infrastructure that could use that. So this just shows you, this organizational chart shows you by site where we're located. A lot of people, probably not the people on this call, think imaging facilities is another word for WIMIC, which is the Wolfson Molecular Imaging Centre in Withington. But what this slide shows is that we're much more than one building. So in WIMIC, if I start off with that, because that's where the bulk of our activity is, or bulk of our equipment is, I should say. So we've got clinical scanners, and I will go through these in some, not heavy detail, but some detail shortly. So we've got MR scanner on site, clinical. And the reason the PET scanners are in orange is because they've already reached their end of life. So they're still in situ, but we're not using them anymore for clinical work. The preclinical side of things, we've got PET-CT, MR, small animal radiation research platform, and also bioluminescence, that's BLI at the bottom. And then until December 2020, we had a radiochemistry facility that manufactured radio tracers for human injections, and also for preclinical. And since July, that's been leased to the Medicines Discovery Catapult. And I know we've got DFAF on the call anyway, who works for MDC. So that's now leased to them to manufacture tracers, but primarily for preclinical work, as I understand it. Apologies in the meantime for the cat tail appearing in my screen. I'm trying to keep her off the desk. So the next location we're at, it's Stockford Building, which everybody knows. So we've got a preclinical 7T MR scanner there. The clinical research facility on Grafton Street, we've got an MR scanner. We've got the PET-MR scanner at MFT, So that's at St Mary's Hospital. And then the one on the far right is the latest addition to the stable, which is another 3 TMR scanner that's actually owned by Salford Royal, and that's located at that hospital site. So I mentioned before, so we'd moved into research and business engagement in December 2020, and we were formerly part of DIDS in health sciences. And we have a new director of imaging, Stavros Stivaros, some of you might know, and he joined us in December 2020 as well. So we've gone through an awful lot of change in the last 6 months, and that's parking the pandemic to one side. So that's saying something. So I'll go into the modalities now. So start off with preclinical imaging. So this is the equipment that we have at each site, which I've talked about just before. Just to say as well, at WMIC, we also have an animal handling unit, which is really good. So if we've got animals on site who need to be injected with whatever they need to be injected with, they can stay on site for, I think it's up to a year, something like that, but with regular checks from the BSF and our vets as well to make sure that the animals are all okay. And it's mainly rodents that we image. So Stockford, as I mentioned, the preclinical MR scanner, and then we've got staff that cover both sites. So we've got a senior experimental officer, research fellow, who's called Ben Dickey, and then a couple of preclinical lab technicians as well, who will actually do all the scanning work and the injections of radio tracers for PET CT scanning. So we also have what's known as the PRIME meeting, which is preclinical executive, whereby any applications for using any of these facilities go through. They're discussed locally because we're subject to a lot of regulatory regulations, I suppose, in terms of the Home Office licenses and also radiation with us injecting radio tracers. So certainly at WMIC, high security building because of the radioactivity that's on site. So these are the types of activities that happen with preclinical imaging. I won't go through them all, but it just gives you a flavour of the different types of activities that we scan against. I think drug discovery is really interesting, especially with the translational hat on. And what we see with imaging is that the translational work can take decades. Because if you're thinking about drugs, you know, you're testing them in rodents, then you've got to go into the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials before it hits the clinic. So it's an awfully long pathway, which actually impacts quite heavily on our research outputs, because we tend not to have those for some time after the imaging has actually happened. So if we move on to MR imaging, this is the Salford scanner. So that was installed in March this year. As part of an upgrade program that the trust was pulling together. So they upgrade, I think they put in about 3 or 4 new scanners. This is the only one that the university is involved with. So these are the MR scanners that we've got. So one at WMIC, clinical research facility, and then the Salford ones I've just shown you before. So until July 2020, the university scanner was in situ at Salford. That was then decommissioned because I think at that point it was 16 years old, which is pushing it a little bit with an MR scanner. And then the university contributed to the purchase price of this new scanner, and we've now got 21 hours a week access, which is a phenomenal amount of hours actually that we can work with to get some new studies and clinical trials set up there. Salford is especially important because it's the Centre of Excellence for Neurosciences, and then we'll know about the Geoffrey Jefferson Research Centre as well that we're working with in terms of getting some new studies set up. So other than the Salford scanner, we've got an MR physicist who visits all the other sites and does weekly checks to make sure the scanners are working optimally. He also works on developing new sequences for studies, teaching, and also research work. So moving briefly on to MR imaging and what it's all about. What do we do? As I said before, it's multiple disease areas. And the translational impact is obviously quicker with clinical scanning. And with apologies for using a link to the Daily Mail to begin with, there's one link there which talks about oxygen enhanced MRI. So this is where, and I'm not a radiographer, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but where a participant actually is given up to 100% oxygen during a scan. So you can see the impact of oxygen on a tumour. And this particular activity that was led by James O'Connor went far and wide in terms of the press. So you can see sort of the instant impact of that sort of work. And we're also quite well known for our functional MRI, which is where a participant is given tasks to do during a scan, and then you can instantly see the impacts on the brain of what's happening there. So one of the huge benefits for us in terms of translational research is MR is widely used across the NHS, as we know. We offer 1.5T and 3T, so some are better for some disease areas than other ones. We've had some huge challenges, certainly in terms of the COVID restrictions, that being face-to-face research and very much close contact work. So we've seen a huge impact on our scanning numbers there, which is unfortunate. We're starting to pick back up. But what we have, excuse me, continue to do as well is offer clinical scanning for the NHS, so to help with their waiting lists. So as well as generating income, that also means the radiographers keep up to date with their skills. So you mentioned, Alessandro, before about with Anya about new researchers, early career researchers, and that's a particular push for us at the moment as well. We've been very much used to the same researchers again and again using imaging, and we want to really extend that to not just FBMH but other faculties and outside trusts also. So what we're doing, so we've done this a while ago, but it stopped during the pandemic, is have a call for what we call MR imaging grants, whereby researchers can apply for up to 20 hours of free scanning, and that will allow them to generate pilot data that can go into grant applications. It's a little bit chicken and egg scenario. They need to have that data to show the funder that there is a need to do that particular study. So that will be coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and that will probably focus on the Salford scanner. I think it should do, with that being the brand new scanner that we've got in at the moment. So PET-MR scanner. So this is one of only 8 scanners in the UK that combines PET imaging with MR imaging. That's located at St Mary's Hospital in Manchester University Foundation Trust, and that's part of a much bigger suite that was opened in June 17 by Lem Cisse, Nancy Rothwell, Kathy Cowell from the Trust as well. It was a really, really good opening event. This was funded by the Medical Research Council as part of the Dementias Platform UK initiative, and that covers not just the 8 PET-MR scanner sites, but also other institutes that are interested in dementia scanning. So this opens us up for multi-centre trials, which is really exciting. So the technical stuff, it's a GE Signa PET-MR scanner. We installed it in, it went in September 15. And actually was commissioned in 2016. So what we can do with that is simultaneous PET-MR scanning. So you'll have heard of PET-CT scanning, and then also MR scanning as standalone methods of imaging. This actually combines PET with MR, so there's no CT involved there. And for those, we inject participants with radio tracers. So that's when you can see where the radio tracer ends up. I'm really sorry, my cat is really starting to annoy me now, so I'll just get rid of her. And what we used to do until December 2020 is use novel tracers that we used to produce at the Wolfson Molecular Imaging Centre. I'll come on to that shortly, because that facility is actually closed now. So we can also use the scanner for standalone 3T MR scanning, which is probably used the bulk of at the moment for MR scanning. So we have our own radiographers, we've got PET physicists, MR physicists, and also because we work locally with the Trust, and also we need them, we've got contracts with the Trust for various experts to allow us to run the scanner as a PET-MR scanner. So really heavily regulated, as you'd probably guess. So the main applications for us are dementia, oncology. Dementia at the moment, oncology is some area that we want to move into. What we found with the 2 initial PET-MR scanners in London, they are used about 60% for prostate imaging. So that's already in the clinic. So that's something that we really want to work on. So we're talking with colleagues about getting some studies set up with that. And then our director of imaging, Stavros, is a pediatric neuroradiologist. So he has a specific interest in pediatric imaging, especially neuroimaging. And the reason why PET-MR is so good for this is because there's a reduced imaging time for participants. So they no longer need a separate PET-CT scan and a separate MR scan. And because they're not having the CT element of a PET-CT scan, they can also get lower doses of radioactive material injected into them, which is a win-win for everybody involved. But there are huge challenges with PET-MR. Combining those two modalities in terms of staff health and safety regulations is a huge challenge, and one that's ongoing. Not least, radiographers tend to be trained in either MR or PET. There aren't really any PET-MR radiographers that can cover both modalities. So that's an issue, that's a national issue that the DP UK network is looking at. Access to novel radio tracers. So the standard tracer that's used is something called FDG, which is used in your general cancer imaging in the clinic. But obviously our researchers would like access to the novel radio tracers that we used to manufacture until December, and they could be shipped down to PET-MR by about 11 o'clock every morning. Now we're having to go to commercial manufacturers and other academic imaging centres who do make radio tracers, because there are no local ones in Greater Manchester. Access to those tracers is getting to be really difficult. So some of them don't appear until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then you've got to let, once you've injected that into the participant, you've got to let that uptake for up to an hour and then do the scan. So we're having now to look at working arrangements for our radiographers. So that's really changed our view on how we work. We also have a challenge in terms of bringing clinicians on board into this new modality. It's brand new. A lot of them have never heard of it before and need to be convinced of the efficacy of it. And we're really looking to try and make PET-MR the imaging modality of choice, where patients currently need separate PET and separate MR scans. And for that, we're working with GE, who's the scanner manufacturer, to develop an online seminar, or even maybe an open day, who knows, we can actually meet in real life, to get clinicians on board from trusts across Greater Manchester, further afield, academics, clinicians within the university, just to see what we can do to raise awareness of the imaging modality and what PET-MR can do for researchers. And for more information, you can contact me there if you want to apply to use any of our scanners. So we have a full process for clinical scanning as well as preclinical scanning. And for clinical scanning, we need to make sure you've got all the regulatory documentation in place to run imaging. We've got a website that's just recently been updated, and we have a Twitter feed as well. Thank you very much for your time.